Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, we shall talk about the qualitative and quantitative aspects of economy. And I would not be focusing on just, the quality of goods per se or their quantity, but I shall focus on more general problem, like kernel problem after he was promoted into general problem, sort of. And I would perhaps indicate on some of the downfalls of the quantitative aspects of the economy, like things like, GDP and other aggregate indicators like that. But we'll see, we'll talk about it. So, the first thing I wish to bring to your attention to illustrate my point, hopefully, is the so-called broken window parable, which was demonstrated to be false. I mean, it's now called broken window fallacy, like a century and a half ago, and yet somehow some people, especially Marxists and statists and, supporters of the big government, etc., they still think that, broken windows really help the economy somehow. So let's analyze that. And by the way, so it was demonstrated in the works of Frédéric Bastiat, the French economist, in literally I think 1850. He published a book that was called Which is Seen and Which is Not Seen, which is frankly the best book on economics you can think about. So I certainly recommend you to read it if you didn't yet. But again, this point seems to somehow evade the attention of people, so I wish to bring it up here, this broken window fallacy. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that the citizen Keynes walked to the house of the citizen Hayek and threw a rock into his window and broke it and just ran away, right? So citizen Keynes honestly believed that this would drive the economy, this would increase GDP, etc., because he argued, well, think about it. Hayek would spend some money to repair his window, which means that this money would go to the people who install the glass, whatever the people who produce the glass, whatever the people who are, I don't know, digging the sand or whatever you need to make the glass. So, and transportation and all of that, and taxes and all of that. So all this money would be injected into the economy, and it would make the economy work, so everyone would become wealthier, according to Keynes, right? But unfortunately, although this indeed does elevate GDP, all else being equal, in itself, so to speak, but I would claim that wealth in the economy, like the cumulative wealth, did not increase, nevertheless, right? Even though GDP would rise and show us some, supposedly growth. And you can compare these two situations directly, like the situation where the citizen Keynes destroyed the window and the situation where he didn't do that, right? So in the first situation, okay, he breaks the window, Hayek has to pay for replacement, so now he has the same window, but he doesn't have the same amount of money he did before, okay? And the second situation is where his window is safe and he has this money that he would otherwise spend on the repairs, right? So now, in this second situation, since he has this extra money, he can spend this money on something else. Like maybe he would save this money to buy a car, half a year later, or maybe he would send this money to his relatives who are in need, or maybe he would buy some clothes, or maybe he would buy something else, So this money would work eventually in this form or another. But since it didn't in this first situation where the glass was broken, so the money came to, basically the economy worked only on self-replacement, no additional wealth was generated. Only the same glass was sort of repeated again, you know, replaced literally. So yeah, I would claim that there was no increase in wealth, and in fact there was decrease in wealth, because in the first situation we have glass as like a physical, you know, entity, and in the second situation we have glass plus something else, which Hayek could have bought if his window wasn't broken, right? So, and you can think about the, well, okay, so it illustrates the point that basically the destruction of goods, of wealth or whatever, of capital, it really only makes resources scarce. And I don't think there's anything controversial in this point. Like, literally, there's less glass, you know, after the glass was broken. So the amount of resources diminished due to this action. And it's sort of like what happens during monopolization of some area, but we'll talk about that later, how violence induces monopolization. And the whole situation just made everyone poorer, because there's less goods, there's less wealth in the society, because, well, at least there's one window less in the society, you know. So yeah, it makes everyone poorer. And you can think about it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is sort of like a stupid thing in philosophical sense, but as a proxy, you know, in economics, it's kind of works, at least, you know, in some interval, so to speak. So, and the point of economic development, I would claim, is that you climb this hierarchy, right? So what happens is that you satisfy some of your needs, and then you have some extra resources to spend on some other needs, which are perhaps less pressing or something like that. So if, let's say, your window was broken, you are like forcefully, violently pushed down the hierarchy. You need to spend more resources on something that you've already had, but you lost because of this violent activity of citizen Keynes, for example, right? So, and I think it's more or less clear to everyone since the marginalist revolution in the 19th century. Again, not talking about Marxists and Keynesians and all those people who support government regulation, since they still seem to be obsessed with this aggregates, you know, economic, again, the whole thing that I'm calling quantitative aspects of economics, right? But my point is that they basically misunderstand the nature of wealth and like really basic things about the economics. So destruction of goods, destruction of wealth makes you kind of stuck in these lower levels of hierarchy of needs. So you cannot really get higher, because you need to spend money to at least replenish whatever you've lost because of violence, you know, this external violence. All right? So violence leads to redistribution of wealth, or at least redistribution of preferences, you know, consumer preferences. So Hayek wanted to spend this money on something else, like, I don't know, a dance school for his child or something like that, or new clothes or new car, whatever. But he was forced to spend this money on new glass, basically, because of this violence, right? And Keynes was actually a fan of this idea of changing the preferences of the public through government expenses, basically. And it's been one of the major points in his book, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, I think, which was published in 1936. And among other things, he actually said that, you know, in order to make people spend money, we can actually force them to dig holes in the ground. Well, maybe he didn't actually talk about forcing people. He actually said, like, we might bury bottles with you know, dollar bills inside or something like that. But essentially it's like, yeah, like forcibly changing people's preferences for doing something else than whatever they wanted to be doing, right? So let's examine this situation. If we somehow force the people to dig holes in the ground, well, let's just reduce it to one big hole, okay? So let's say we have this mega infrastructure project, which is just digging a huge hole in the ground, which is a perfectly fitting thing for any, you know, socialist, Marxist, Keynesian economy. Okay, so in this case, I would say that we're forcing not only Hayek to spend his money, but the whole society to spend their money on this particular project, right? Because, well, obviously it's being done with the help of government, and government doesn't really have its own money. It has only money of all the citizens, right? So yeah, if government spends money on digging this huge hole, it's really all the people are forced to spend their money to dig the huge hole. And it's a triumph for Keynesians because they love when other people spend money on whatever they want. I mean, Keynesians want. Yeah. So in this case, let's say the government was stupid enough to follow Keynes and dig this hole in the ground. So again, we have pretty much two situations. Like, we have one situation where the society has money, like some accumulated wealth, some accumulated perhaps labor resources, etc., which might be exchanged for money. And the second situation is where we have a huge hole and we don't have money or extra resources. So which situation is better, you might ask? Well, clearly, I think if you're at least a little bit sane, you would say that the first situation is better, when we have money, extra resources to spend, etc., rather than the huge hole. Why would we need a huge hole, you know? Would you pay voluntarily for this huge hole? I don't think so. So thus, it can only be achieved through government, you know. And in first situation, we still have extra money and extra labor resources to be spent perhaps on something else, like, I don't know, roads, schools, healthcare, like food production, infrastructure, arts, science, whatever. Like, there's like a million things you can do with extra labor and extra money. Like, but would you really like this all to be spent on this huge hole? I don't think so. Well, again, maybe you would, but yeah. So basically, digging this hole might have even might have given GDP a rise because, well, yeah, something is something is getting done. I mean, people are working, etc. But, well, is wealth really increasing? Like, basically, you're wasting resources, wasting labor, etc., on doing that instead of doing all those other things I've listed above, right? So I would say that wealth actually decreased because of that, even though GDP might show you a rise. So again, it's another indication that these quantitative indicators are really crappy, you know? We have to look at what's going on in society. So, and the more general point again is that, to be taken from this example, is that violence really warps the economy. It sort of like introduces artificial needs, you know. It's almost like the government spending this money on digging the hole, like the economy sort of thinks that people need this hole because money go into digging this hole, right? And so money is just redistributed into these wrong areas. And I would actually say that it's sort of like a general intermission here. I would say that money is actually, I would define money as information about the amount of good you did to someone. So you have this much money, at least in free market economy, but I mean, yeah. So you have this much money as much good you did to someone else. Because if you think about it, on a free market, again, all the deals are, all the contracts are voluntary, which means that if you have money, you only give your money to someone who gives you something good in exchange because, well, you thought that this deal would bring you something good. So you deemed whatever they're giving to you more valuable than the money you give them in exchange, right? So the more money they have from you, the more good they did to you as a result of this transaction, you know? So it makes perfect sense in my opinion. But if you warp this system, this free market voluntary system, with violence, like taxation, which is robbery, obviously, it's, you know, some libertarians, I made this point previously, but some libertarians say that taxation is theft, but it's not really theft, it's robbery. I mean, theft is something that's done covertly, you know, but taxation is done in the open. It's basically, I'm taking this from you, that's what taxation is. So, yeah, so money basically, in my definition, is the information, again, in the situation of the free market, is the information about the amount of good you did to someone, right? Since all the deals are voluntary. But if the deals are not voluntary, as in statism, as we have today in pretty much everywhere, all the countries in the world, money might be, you know, false information in this sense. If money is created by the central bank, let's say, but we'll talk about that later, a little bit later. So in market economy, as I've said, there's no violence, and people just buy whatever they want. They just give their money to whoever they think did something good, like to them in particular. Or you might have, you know, charity, where you just care about someone and you just give them money. So yeah, so you appreciate them, and you show that by giving them money. And in this sense, well, it kind of works also, right? So, but if we have a free market system, obviously the producers of glass windows and diggers of big holes might be not very happy, right? Because nobody would pay for that voluntarily if you know, citizen Keynes weren't breaking their glasses and you know, ordering people to dig huge holes. So these people would be unhappy, and they might turn to the government and again said, well, you know, Mr. Government, please force people to pay us to do all those stupid things that reduce the wealth of the whole society but increase our wealth in exchange, right? And that's how you get monopolies. This is exactly what happens, right? When, let's say, restrictions on competition arise, or like price regulations arise, or something like that. So let's say, with the help of government, obviously, because it's the only way monopolies can arise. So let's say Hayek was forced to pay, let's say, $300, roughly speaking, for repair of his window instead of $200, because government reduced the competition through various taxes and regulations. So I mean, in the market of glass producers, let's say. So what happened is that the bad producer of glass received $300, and the good producer of glass, who would have been on the market if not for the government, did not receive $200, and plus Hayek paid more than he would otherwise would. So probably you can see that the overall wealth of the society diminished. Good people didn't receive money, bad people did receive money, and good people lost more money than otherwise they would. So Hayek was not able to allow himself to buy other stuff other than this glass for this extra $100 that he had to spend on the glass that was, you know, whatever, like this monopoly, so to speak, or like quasi-monopoly that have arisen thanks to the government regulations. So yeah, it's not a very good situation. Or you can think about protectionism, or in general lobbyism. Like protectionism basically means, well, we shall support our local producers, right? So however good the imported goods are, we shall somehow prohibit them or make them more expensive than they should be in the natural situation. I mean, without quotas and tariffs and whatever, blah, blah, blah. So just because the producer of something lives nearby and he can lobby to the local government, well, you get more expensive and worse goods than you otherwise would if all those barriers didn't exist. So it diminishes the wealth of the whole society. Like if you buy a local car for $10,000 instead of imported car of the same quality for $8,000, like the whole society just lost $2,000 to support these stupid producers of these lower quality and more expensive cars that wouldn't be able to compete with imported cars otherwise, right? So yeah, so protectionism, it's again the same thing. It's monopolization with the help of government, right? And at everyone's expense. Again, if you remember my video about Archimedes' lever, I talked about that even the people who benefit from protectionism in the long run actually suffer from it, because all the society becomes poorer, including themselves and their children especially, etc., etc. But somehow they're either too stupid or too careless to think about it. Okay, so yeah, and if you think about the absolute limit of protectionism, well, you can think about the the type of economy, like natural economy, subsistence economy, like the kind of economy you could have in medieval times, in Middle Ages, where basically you only consumed whatever you can produce on your own, like, so there was virtually no trade, or at least, in certain regions. There were obviously some trade alliances of cities, etc., etc. But yeah, so if your ideal is Middle Age type of economy and the appropriate amount of wealth and, like in general quality of life, then yeah, certainly promote protectionism. Like, yeah, that's exactly what you need in this case if you want to return to the Middle Ages. But yeah, so the government has this monopoly on violence, obviously. I mean, it has army and police, etc. And it has monopoly on conflict settlement, like courts and lawmaking. And so, yeah, so this fundamental monopoly attracts all the other ones, right? So government has the power to introduce monopolism, which it happily does all the time. So, but at the same time, government doesn't really create extra money. That's an important thing that people somehow forget frequently. Basically, the only money government has comes from people, right? That way or another. But at the same time, government has, again, all this variety of tools to warp the preferences, the consumer preferences. But, okay, so you might say, well, government might actually create money because it has monopoly on money creation also, again. Well, I've talked about that in many more detail in my video about, again, Archimedes' lever of speculation. So I'll only mention it briefly here that, yeah, the monopoly, the existence of central banks, the monopoly of government to creating money, it really leads to poverty. It leads to a whole bunch of other negative consequences, such as that banks become riskier. I mean, even private banks, because they are backed up by the government monopoly. And it all drives this malinvestment the investment in whatever, because you have free money, so why not spend it somewhere, right? It creates all those investment bubbles, this boom and bust cycle, so-called. And again, I refer to these videos about rap battle between Hayek and Keynes. It's really brilliant. And the first video is exactly about boom and bust cycle, how Keynesians and other statists completely misunderstand the nature of economic cycles, that they are produced by the government intervention. Then it drives inflation, obviously, as the government prints more and more money and gives it to its friends in the banks. There's more money in the economy, and therefore the prices rise, right? Which also leads to consumerism, because people see, well, the prices are rising, let's spend more today rather than save, right? So it kind of drives the preferences towards more spending rather than more saving. And again, somehow it's blamed on the free market. Like, what the hell? Like, where's free market here? It's the government that gives you the inflation, right? It's the government that drives the consumerism, that drives poverty and inequality. Like, the government gives this money to bankers, and the banker give the money to their friends too. Like, it's not like the evil capitalism generates this extra money, you know? Again, in capitalism, as I've stated before, money is only given to whoever you want to give it to. It's not like money comes from there, you know? It comes from you, again, on the free market, but unfortunately we don't have a free market today. And another tool of how government-induced inflation increases inequalities through so-called Cantillon effect. So Cantillon is a French economist, I guess, or maybe he was actually Scottish. I don't know. Don't really know. Don't remember. But anyway, well, I mean, the last name is clearly French. But the effect is such. So basically what happens is that inflation is not homogeneous across the society, right? So what happens when government creates a low load of new money, it goes firstly, again, to bankers and to like large industry and agriculture, basically friends of bankers, right? So rich people, let's say, right? And what that means is the rest of the economy still doesn't have this money. So these rich people who now have extra money, they might spend this money into the rest of the economy, which is so to speak, not yet aware of this extra money existing. So the prices are not that high yet for these rich people who are first to spend this money. So they are first to spend this money, and then as the economy digests this new money, so to speak, prices rise, and when this new money finally reaches poor people, which is like several cycles after, poor people encounter higher prices, you know. So I mean, higher than the ones encountered by the rich people when they first got the new money. So that's another instrument of redistribution of wealth with the help of government towards the rich people from the poor people. And I mean, it really, if you think about it, it's so sick. But anyway, if you're a statist, if you're a socialist, definitely support your government because, well, why not? It makes rich people richer. It makes poor people poorer. So yeah, I think it's clear from what I've stated that it's not the market that creates all those negative things. It's really regulation that drives crises. Again, if you want a good example, well, what better example there is other than Great Depression, right? So since the establishment of the Fed in 1913 until like 1928, so that's like 15 years, the money supply increased mysteriously 3 times in the US. So what do you think that would drive? well, that would drive malinvestment, risky banking behavior, and all that jazz, you know, because, well, again, there is a government monopoly on money right now after the establishment of Fed. And what happens a year later in 1929? Well, you probably know, right? Great Depression, which basically lasted until like late 1940s, you know, really, thanks to the reinforcement of all these problems by regulations from Hoover and Roosevelt's administrations, who really, like, basically it's like 1929 to let's say 49, that's 20 years. So that's a whole lost generation, lost in poverty and war also, thanks to all these bright people, the statists. So yeah, these are the people who, you know, steal people's childhood, you know. How dare you, you know? So, but on the free market, in contrast to that, there would be no risky banks, no risky investments, because, well, those people who would promote those risky investments, well, they would basically bankrupt themselves pretty quickly. There would be no one to bail them out, you know, as again happened multiple times, like famously in 2008 and 2009. Like all these huge bankers were saved by the government, by the huge influx of new money, which again made everyone poorer, even, you know, taking into account the whole crisis situation, like extra poor, you know, in addition to that. So there would be no extra money on the free market to feed all those investment bubbles that we have today, for example. Again, like, the next crisis is like literally on the threshold. Like, I think it's clear for everyone. And there would be no inflation, no consumerism. Again, see my video about Archimedes' lever, because, well, people would be incentivized to save more rather than spend more, right? There would be less inequality, again, due to there would be no one to give more money to rich people, basically, right? Rich people would only be able to get more money from you, basically. And you might actually look at no cronyism, you know, things like that. You might actually look at the Gini coefficient, which is kind of like the mathematical measure of inequality, and its relation to the economic freedom, like, for example, indexed by Cato Institute. So you would see that if you take a look at World Bank data, I think I've mentioned that already in some other video, but anyway, so there is an anti-correlation between the index of economic freedom and Gini index across the world. So the freer your economy is, the less inequality there is, basically. And it's not a big surprise. So, yeah. And perhaps there might be a fall in GDP in free market with respect to, you know, this government-regulated market. But still there would be a rise in wealth because of that, because of these qualitative aspects, right? Because people are able to buy what they need rather than what they are forced to buy by the government or whoever else. And yeah, if you only look at the quantitative aspect, you completely miss that. You completely miss wealth. You completely misunderstand how wealth is accumulated, what the nature of wealth is, right? And downfalls in market economy might be only local and short, like all the hypothetical panics, you know, in late 19th century during, you know, the Gilded Age in the US, like there weren't any negative economic consequences. It's like maybe a month of this so-called panic, and maybe nominally GDP drops, but again, since there's deflation essentially, like wealth doesn't drop, like nobody really cares, people go on as usual. And again, if you have like, I don't know which, well basically Gilded Age was like probably the most free period, I mean, like roughly after the Civil War and before the age of progressivism, you know, basically the induction of statism in, well, let's say the year 1900 for clarity, for simplicity. So these like 30 plus years were the freest years and also the wealthiest years for the US. Like, the economy wasn't growing as fast, never again, actually, you know. And it's not a big mystery, again, considering everything else I've said already. So downfalls might happen, but again, they would be local and short. They would never spill out into the whole economy, like all the downfalls that happened later when we had centralized banking system controlled by the government. So market is the equilibrium type of system. So if somebody invests too much in some branch of the economy, well, they just don't get any returns, so they bankrupt themselves, and that's it. So, and then this perhaps local downfall that occurs during this time, it's really actually a sign of recovery, you know. It means that the money just disappeared, well, not disappeared, money just redistributed to some other areas where they are more needed, where people are actually ready to pay for whatever the people are investing in, right? But not this particular area. But sometimes governments obviously love to sort of freeze the whole process in this sixth stage, you know, when they don't allow the recovery to happen, you know. They see there's a downfall, they say, oh no, we should do something. So they start pouring money, or they start supporting this branch with something like tax, lowering of taxes, subsidies, loans, some additional protectionist measures or whatever. So this wrong investment that wasn't supported by consumers is now supported by the government. So you, as a consumer, in the end, get more of something that you didn't even want. Basically, that's what government does. And, well, is that a good thing? I don't think so. But yeah, that's how things look from the, you know, accountant's perspective, from the perspective of a Keynesian, of a socialist, of statist, whatever, social democrat, you know, or whatever other stupid human being. So, yeah. And, well, considering all that, you might ask, well, what if there was a smart person in the government, you know, and he would have said, maybe we're doing something wrong. So what should we do, you know, as smart regulators? Like, maybe we should give more money to this branch rather than this one, as we did previously. Or maybe we should lower the taxes for this branch and make them higher for this branch of the economy. I mean, well, I think that if you're a sane person, that would be, the answer would be obvious from everything that I've said previously, is that the best thing a government official might do is to deregulate rather than regulate. And that's it. That's the whole answer. Like, reduce the amount of regulations, lower the taxes, lower the spending. Like, if you Google something like economic regulations, amount of pages per year or something, well, I was horrified when I first saw that, you know, because, well, just look at the pictures again. And somebody is saying after that we're living, or at least some fraction of the world lives in a free economy. Well, no. like if you look at the dynamics, it doesn't look like that at all. Like, basically, well, I would claim that the US and European Union, of course, and like most of the world is governed by socialism right now. There is barely no free market, like almost no free market, I should have said. So yeah, minimize regulations if you're a smart person. For example, there's argument by Mises in his book from 1922, Socialism, that was translated into English in 1936. that price regulation makes economic calculation impossible. Well, because if you regulate prices, you basically regulate preferences of people. So you don't know what the actual preferences of people are, you know. And so regulation warps the economy and introduces imbalances into it, which leads to crises, which leads to ruining the whole economy. Now, of course, external markets, like if your market is highly regulated and is not even a market anymore, you might take a look at external markets and still derive some prices from them if they are much freer than yours. That did help Soviet Union, for example, a lot, because Soviet planners were orienting on the external prices in more freer economies, and that helped, for example, Stalin to introduce industrialization, because he used basically slave labor of Soviet citizens, most of which weren't actually citizens, because, you know, peasants in the Soviet Union didn't even have passports, so they were like really slaves until like 1970s, or maybe 1980s, or 70s. So he had this slave labor plus imported specialists like Germans, Americans, British, who were building or at least engineering all those factories, etc., etc., and obviously foreign investment, again, from Germany, from the US, from England and other countries. So it's this knowledge of the external markets that has allowed industrialization to happen in the Soviet Union. And it's not a big wonder that, you know, a lot, perhaps even most, of industrial products like cars and whatever, things like that, were produced in the Soviet Union were literally just copies of foreign goods. Yeah. So yeah, and I think that if the Soviet Union was to make another like round, another, I don't know, wave of industrialization like that in like 70s or 80s, it might have been alive to this day, you know. It needed this refreshment, but again, it didn't have any, because, well, partly because it just crumbled under its own ideology that, you know, we don't need the stupid West and the stupid market. So yeah, maybe it's a good thing it did collapse after all. It's actually a good thing, yeah. But unfortunately, somehow people don't understand why, which is because socialism is not viable. And so the important issue, of course, here is that how do you transition from socialism to free market, or at least somewhat free market? And it's indeed a serious problem, because socialism, again, if you look at it from a quantitative perspective, I mean, even the economic thought in the Western world is infected by statism, etc. Again, Keynesianism and all that stupid crap. So socialism, quantitatively, might actually grow your GDP, and actually quite fast. But unfortunately, it does that by warping the economy. Again, as I've said, socialism, I would claim, is an investment bubble in itself, actually. So socialism redistributes everything, and it makes people spend money for something that they wouldn't like to spend money on otherwise, you know, if they weren't forced to do that, you know, by the government. So it obviously warps the employment system, etc., etc. So people work on the industries and whatever factories that wouldn't even be able to exist in a free market, because they would produce some rubbish stuff for a very high price. I mean, price in terms of like spending of labor and resources, etc. So uncompetitive, you know, type of production, but they would still work there because the existence of these factories or whatever is being allowed by the existence of the violence from the government, redistribution, right? So so the transition to the free market from such a system obviously would destroy all those uncompetitive productions, and you might see a drop in GDP because of that, right? But it was only because they were overrated previously, right? And yeah, so this redistribution of production did happen previously. And some branches of economy might actually completely die out during this transition. And it's completely normal. Again, it's the sign of recovery, that resources are being drawn away back from these unviable branches of economy again. Now, how long and bad would this process of transition be? That's another question. And I would say that it depends on history. It depends on how badly into socialism you've fallen previously. And plus, obviously, it depends on the willingness of the new government, whatever the government is producing these reforms, promoting them, how willing they are to change, you know, how willing they are to reduce all those barriers standing in the way of a free market. Like, one good example of transition from socialism to free market might be Poland. Of course, there are, many things you can say about Poland, that they're integrated now into this basically socialistic European Union system, and they actually receive subsidies from the European Union, etc., etc. But still, they, like, all else being equal, they're doing pretty well. Very much unlike all the rest of the post-Soviet world. Like, post-Soviet world is really stuck in this half-sick phase. So it was like frozen in this recovery stage when it did already fall due to the collapse of socialism, but it didn't rise because there was not enough free market still. Like, everything is regulated anyways. So there was no willingness to change in some sense. Well, in my country, that's really obvious. Well, in Russia, for example, in early 2000s, they really did good in terms of reforms. Like, the first presidential term of Putin was actually very liberal, and like 2000 to 2003, let's say. But then, and maybe on some level even up to 2006 maybe, but then it just went to socialism again, and all the growth they've had from 2006 until 2012 was really only this growth that was made possible by these first liberal reforms of Putin in early 2000s. Of course, some people say that there were liberal reforms in the 90s, but no. If you look at what was happening, it was really just a robbery of the all these, again, factories and resources by the friends of the former socialistic administrators. Like, real, more or less liberal reforms started in early 2000s in Russia, and they quickly disappeared basically. But still, Russia has grown somewhat because of them. Anyway, yeah, what was I talking about? Yeah, so basically, post-Soviet world is still stuck in this, near bottom stage after the socialistic way of production collapsed, but free market way of production never even happened because, well, there was no free market here yet. So there's this slow drift to poverty, or rather to more poverty, from initial poverty. And yeah, so it's a very complex phenomenon. How do you transition to a free economy from not free economy? Because there's obviously a huge political pressure from these former lobbyists, from the formerly privileged people, to whom the wealth was redistributed through the government, through the previous government that now collapsed, right? So they would demand from the new government you know, return us our privileges, keep redistributing forcibly money of the people to us. Because, well, I've been working on this factory for like 20 years. Why wouldn't I work on it right now, right? So, yeah, keep giving me money that I don't deserve because I produce stupid crap that nobody wants to pay for, and I've been doing that for all my life. So why should I stop right now with your stupid free market, right? And it's quite understandable. You can think about the analogy with I don't know, maybe like a sick person. A good example right here. Sorry. So a sick person that's like on painkillers, and the person is very sick, but like the doctor slowly diminishes the amount of painkillers they receive to like make them aware of their sickness. It's like the analogy of demolition of socialistic economy, and like making people aware how warped the whole economic system was previously, right? So this person might say, you know, doc, I don't feel really well. I did feel pretty good previously, so can you return my painkillers back? So this is basically what happened in my country when basically like sort of like a restoration of a quasi-Soviet order happened in 1994, like literally three years after we gained independence from the Soviet Union. So yeah, not a very good story. And actually, in general, I would say that the best analogy I've come up with so far for the socialistic economy is heroin addiction or any other serious drug addiction. So, you know, a heroin junkie, that's the socialist or like socialistic economy, all the, you know, neurochemical pathways are so disrupted by this addiction that they don't even know what's normal life anymore, you know, what's free market anymore. So, but they kind of feel good sometimes, at least, you know, as long as this violent, unnatural thing keeps happening, socialism keeps happening. So when they go, let's say, cold turkey, they kind of, the free market emerges, you know, the system collapses. Well, they don't feel very well, you know. And so many people stayed because of that, look at that, Soviet Union collapsed and there was this incredible poverty and all the, you know, the production chains collapsed, etc., etc. Well, yeah, obviously, because all of that was sick production chains. They weren't really satisfying people, so people didn't want to pay for all that voluntarily, so all that collapsed and something else emerged, or like 1/4 emerged because of what I stated previously, that there wasn't really any free market afterwards. There was like quasi something approximating free market, very vaguely resembling. So yeah, but yeah, so if a heroin addict stops taking heroin, he don't feel very well, right? But that's not an argument in favor of heroin addiction, you know. Why did you do that in the first place, you idiot? Why did you become socialist, and why did you warp your economy so much that, you know, whenever people gained freedom, they didn't want all that, you know? Well, that's obvious. You're just stupid. Don't start socialism. Well, unfortunately, it's too late, so the world is up for another, you know, another huge crisis, or probably many of them, since again, free market thinking isn't really prominent today. So we'll have more and more socialism and more crises, and most likely a lot of wars. Like, well, at least there's going to be one huge war, because again, socialism isn't viable, and there isn't anything else in the world. Like the most free economy, which was Hong Kong, like look at that, look at it right now, what's going on in there. So yeah, it's not gonna get any better. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so on this positive note, shall we go to the conclusions? So I would say that again, to conclude my long ramble, the quantitative aspects of the economy, quantitative analysis, shouldn't mask the qualitative aspect of the economy. Like hopefully my examples with the broken window and the hole of Keynes show you how exactly that works, that if you only focus on quantitative things, you might think that, for example, socialist investment bubble is good, or current, investment bubbles reinforced by government monopoly and money is something good, which it isn't, obviously, etc., etc. So you should think about the qualitative side of things, right? And also, qualitative side of things cannot benefit from violence, any type of violence. You need voluntary deals, so you need free market that way or another. And regulations or redistribution of wealth with the help of government, with the help of violence, basically, isn't going to end very well for qualitative side of things, which is the most important side of things, the rise of wealth, right? And probably the last thing I would say is that the more warping you have in your economy, the more statism and socialism you have, the more imbalances you introduce, and like the worse the following crisis would be, like the lower you would fall, right? The more heroin you take in, the worse the rehabilitation would be for you. So, okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.